As you're turning to Gospel of John chapter 2, the Gospels are the true story of the most important story, of the most important person in human history, of course, Jesus Christ, Son of God, King of heaven, Lord of earth, Lamb of God. And we are in the Bible presented with 4 portraits in 4 Gospels, 4 narratives, 4 perspectives by 4 different men telling the same story, but from 4 different perspectives. Why 4? Well, 1 certainly could not be enough. And actually, even having 4 Gospels is really not quite enough. It doesn't tell the whole story. In fact, in the last words of the last verse of the last chapter of the last Gospel, John concludes all of the Gospel narratives with this one sentence. Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world could not have room for the books that would be written. John 21:25. It's an astounding statement. But what we do have a record of what God chose to make available to us, important and included. These 4 perspectives stand as 4 parts of one whole. No one of the gospel narratives were meant to be understood as a full picture of Jesus without the other 3. And as we come to John's gospel, and we've continued to note the unique contributions that John makes of his gospel, the last gospel that was written, John has a way of filling out the story with things that were not contained in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as a way of complementing what was already said. And so I want to, as a way of introduction, as we're stepping into chapter 2, which is a bit of a shift here where we've been, I want to just point out very quickly and briefly, by way of introduction, 3 noteworthy things about the Gospel of John. And I'm purposefully, there's many others, but I'm purposely reducing it to these 3 to help us step into this next section. First thing is the way that John lays out his narrative of Jesus' life and ministry. Second is going to be the theme that he sows throughout the story that he tells. And third is the markers that John has set in which he wraps his version of the story around. So first, the way he lays out the story. If you were looking at a bird's eye view of the Gospel of John, chapter 2 through the end of chapter 12 is a very public picture of Jesus's public ministry and message. Chapter 13 begins a very behind closed doors view of Jesus's more personal, intimate ministry with his disciples. Chapters 2 through 12 cover a period of 3+ years of Jesus's public ministry. Chapters 13 through 20 all take place within a 4-day period. And the epilogue of the gospel, which is the final chapter, chapter 21, takes place over a period of 40 days between Jesus' resurrection and his ascension. So the way John lays out the public ministry of Jesus, the personal private ministry of Jesus to his disciples, very interesting. Second thing is the theme. The theme that John continues to sow throughout how he chooses to tell the story. And it's simply this: believing. Believing is the theme that John sows. Now remember, this is at the end of John's life, or near the end of John's life. He's in his 90s. He seems to be very concerned over the crisis of faith, not just to non-believers, but the crisis of faith happening within his brothers and sisters and the condition of the church, even at the end of the 1st century. It's a crucial factor for John. John employs the Greek word for believing, which is pistou, 98 times in his gospel. Because it's a theme throughout the New Testament, or throughout the Gospel of John, we're going to hit on this theme a number of times as we're moving through it, especially chapter 3. But if I may just give you a picture of what John means by believing. First of all, it's important to note that John 98 times uses the word believing, the Greek word for believing. Never once does he use it in the noun form, only as a verb. A noun, what's a noun? A person, place, or thing, right? That bottled water is a noun. John only uses believing as a verb, an action word. That water bottle is a noun, but if you throw it at my head, the throwing is a verb, right? So think of believing and faith as an action word, not just something, it's just sitting on a table someplace in the corner. It's moving, it's doing something, it's active. But think about this. The biblical concept of believing, especially as John uses it this 98 times in his gospel, think of it as having, it's a compound idea, having two primary parts. First part of believing, think of a concrete slab as a foundation for a house. That's part one of the idea of believing. The second part, the second component of believing is that which you build upon, that foundation. Whatever is built upon that is the second component of believing. And for the sake of this illustration, I'll explain it this way. The slab concrete foundation is knowledge that has been received. It is that which you're being informed or exposed by truth. Specifically, of course, the truth of God, the truth of Jesus Christ. Part two is whatever it is that is built upon that knowledge that you have received. And in this case, think of it as both trust and obedience. You can receive knowledge of the truth, but not act upon it with obedience, and not act upon it as far as having trust towards God. You can receive truth without there ever being a presence of trust and rest and faith in your life. One does not assume the other. So when John talks about believing, it is not only to put the full weight of your trust in, but it is there's an action that looks like. So think of it this way. Believing in John's gospel is literally a believing that is informed by truth, the facts that build that foundation, and it is acted upon by trusting, by resting in, and by obeying that same truth. That is the picture when John says, "For God so loved the world that whoever believes in him." That is what he's saying. Those who not only accept the knowledge of him, but come to put their trust in that truth. Remember John's whole point of the gospel, chapter 20, verse 31. These things were written that you may believe, and in believing you may have life in his name. So, you guys with me so far? So those are two important things to kind of keep in the back of your mind as we're moving into chapter 2. The third is John's unique way that he wraps the story about Jesus. He wraps it around certain markers. And we'll talk about two of those markers real quickly. The first marker is the 7 I am statements of Jesus. I am the bread of life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the resurrection, and so on. Most of us are familiar with the 7 I am statements of Jesus. Of course, those are so essential to understanding the deity of Jesus and what he said about himself. The second marker is 7 signs, 7 miraculous signs. John wraps his gospel narrative around 7 I am statements and 7 miraculous signs. Question: what's the primary purpose of John recounting the 7 I am statements? His primary purpose is confirming who Jesus is, the confirming of his identity. What's the primary purpose of John including these 7 miraculous signs? That is to confirm what he came to do. One has to do with his identity. The other one has to do with his mission, why he came. Now, did Jesus only make 7 statements about himself? No. Did Jesus only perform 7 miracles? No. John said, in chapter 20. But these things were written. These things were written that you may believe. In fact, he says in verse 30, Jesus performed many other signs that I'm not even mentioning in my gospel, in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. So open disclosure, John's going, I can't include everything. Neither could all four of the gospels. But John purposely chose these four signs, miraculous signs, to affirm something very specific about why Jesus came. John included these 7 statements that Jesus said about himself to affirm who he was.